January 10th, 1475. The valley of Podul Înalt, Moldavia, somewhere in what is now eastern Romania. It is before dawn and the temperature has been below freezing for weeks. The Balad River, running through the bottom of this narrow valley, is sluggish and half choked with ice. The ground on either side doesn't freeze solid. It never quite does here, not with the river moisture and the clay soil. So what you get instead is this half-frozen mud that sucks at boots and swallows cartwheels. The hills on both sides of the valley rise steeply, covered in dense oak and beech forest. And those forests are invisible this morning because a winter fog has come down from the hills overnight and settled into the valley like smoke in a bowl. You can't see 10 feet in front of you. You can hear the river. You can hear, somewhere not far away, the creak and clank of a vast army trying to move through difficult ground in the dark. That army belongs to the Ottoman Empire, the empire that 22 years earlier had breached the walls of Constantinople and ended a civilization that had lasted 1,000 years. The empire that had absorbed the Balkans, crushed the Hungarians, outlasted the Venetians, and was, at this moment, the most powerful military force in the known world. By the most conservative estimates, there are somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 combat troops in that column. Cavalry, janissaries, provincial infantry, Tatar auxiliaries, and a support train of Bulgarian conscripts. The larger estimates from contemporary sources put the number above 100,000. On the other side of this fog, waiting in the forests on both sides of the valley, are the Moldavians. Moldavia is not an empire. Moldavia is a principality, roughly the size of the state of Ohio, with a population somewhere around 500,000 people. Its standing army numbers perhaps 10,000 to 15,000 professional soldiers. The rest of what Stephen III has assembled here, and the total figure reaches perhaps 40,000, are farmers, craftsmen, shepherds, men carrying axes they normally use to split wood, bows they normally use to hunt deer, clubs they made themselves because they don't own swords. They are here because their prince passed a law that every able-bodied man over 14 must carry arms, and because their prince burned their own villages before the Ottomans could use them, which means their families are in the mountains to the north, and this valley behind them is all that stands between the Ottoman column and everything they have left. The Ottoman commander, Hadim Suleiman Pasha, does not know any of this. He knows the valley is ahead. He knows Vaslui is the next objective. He knows, or thinks he knows, that the Moldavians might make a stand here. But he has perhaps 80,000 men, and a Moldavian prince with perhaps half that. He has not scouted the valley adequately. He is, by multiple accounts, already unhappy about this campaign. His army is exhausted, the supply lines are a disaster, and the winter is worse than anyone anticipated. But an order from Mehmed II is not something you question. So the Ottoman column moves forward into the fog. And in the forests on both sides, the Moldavians wait. What happens over the next several hours would be called, by a woman who had personally been married to an Ottoman sultan, the worst defeat the empire had ever suffered. The man who engineered it was outnumbered at least 2 to 1, possibly 3 to 1, fighting in the middle of winter, with an army 2/3 composed of peasants who had never been in a battle before. This battle didn't just save Moldavia. It demonstrated something about the Ottoman army that people across Europe had stopped believing was possible, that it could be beaten, that the right ground, the right plan, and the right commander could take the most powerful military machine of the age and turn its own size against it. This is what happened at Podul Înalt on January 10th, 1475. To understand why this battle happened, you have to understand where Moldavia sits on the map, and more importantly, what sitting there means. Moldavia in the 1470s is wedged between four competing powers. To the south and east is the Ottoman Empire, expanding steadily northward. To the west is Transylvania and the Kingdom of Hungary, which has its own ideas about Moldavian independence. To the north is the Kingdom of Poland, which historically treated Moldavia as something close to a vassal. And to the east, across the Prut River, is the open steppe, which means the Crimean Tatars, who are themselves Ottoman vassals and who periodically ride through and burn things for sport. There is no good direction. Every border is a problem. But the specific problem, the one that turns into the Battle of Vaslui, starts at the Black Sea coast. Moldavia controls two ports, Chilia, where the Danube empties into the sea, and Ackerman, further up the coast, which the locals also call Cetatea Alba. These are not just trading posts. They are the anchors of the entire commercial network that runs from the Genoese colony of Kaffa on the Crimean coast down through Moldavia up to the Polish city of Lvov. Merchants from Armenia, from Genoa, from Venice, from the Polish interior, they all move goods through this corridor. The ports collect tolls. The tolls fund the principality. Without Chilia and Ackerman, Moldavia is a landlocked agricultural backwater. With them, it is a viable, independent state. The Ottomans understand this perfectly. Control those ports, and you control Moldavia's economic oxygen. That's been the goal since at least 1420, when the first Ottoman attempt to take Chilia was turned back. For half a century, Moldavia managed to hold on. The man who was holding on when things came to a head was Stephen III, who took the Moldavian throne in April 1457. He was 22 years old, and he got there the old-fashioned way, with swords and outside help. Specifically, he arrived with 6,000 horsemen lent to him by Vlad III of Wallachia, the man history would remember as Vlad the Impaler. And he used them to defeat a rival claimant and install himself as voivode. From the very beginning of his reign, Stephen was someone who solved problems by moving first. He was not a man who waited for things to happen to him. For the first several years, he played the diplomatic game carefully. He continued paying tribute to Constantinople, 2,000 ducats annually, raised from 1470 to 3,000. And he managed his relationships with Hungary and Poland with enough skill to avoid being absorbed by either. But he was also building. Fortresses repaired and reinforced. An army reorganized and expanded. A law that made bearing arms not just a right, but a legal obligation for every free man in the country. He was preparing for something he believed was inevitable. The escalation began in earnest in 1465, when Stephen seized Chilia from the Hungarian Wallachian garrison that controlled it. This was a calculated provocation. Chilia was technically Wallachian territory at this point, and since Wallachia was increasingly an Ottoman client state, taking Chilia was, from Mehmed's perspective, essentially stealing from him. Mehmed filed it away and waited. In 1473, Stephen stopped paying the tribute entirely. At the same time, he launched a military campaign into Wallachia, routed the Ottoman-installed ruler Radu the Handsome at the Battle of Ramnicu-Sarat, a 3-day fight in November, and 4 days later captured Bucharest and placed his own candidate on the Wallachian throne. His candidate was Basarab Laiota, a man who would, in due course, prove to be one of the most faithlessly flexible politicians in a region not short of competition. The logic of Stephen's Wallachian obsession is worth explaining because it gets confusing quickly. Stephen wasn't trying to conquer Wallachia. He was trying to prevent Wallachia from being a base for Ottoman operations against Moldavia. Wallachia's northern border is Moldavia's southern border. An Ottoman-controlled Wallachia means Ottoman armies can march to the Moldavian frontier in a matter of days without fighting through any buffer. Stephen needed a friendly ruler there, not because he wanted to control Wallachia, but because he needed that border to not be hostile. Basarab Laiota held the Wallachian throne for about a year before switching sides and pledging loyalty back to the Ottomans. Stephen invaded again in October 1474, chased Laiota out for the 3rd time, and placed another candidate in Bucharest. Mehmed II had reached his limit. He sent Stephen an ultimatum: return the ports of Chilia and Achaemen to Ottoman control, travel to Constantinople in person to pay homage, and stop interfering in Wallachian affairs. Stephen's response in November 1474 was to write to the Pope, to the King of Hungary, and to the King of Poland, warning them that the Ottomans were coming and asking for military assistance. He did not write back to Mehmed with any concessions. The response from Europe was modest, almost to the point of insult. Hungary sent 1,800 soldiers. Poland sent 2,000 cavalry. The Pope sent a letter. Stephen also recruited 5,000 Zeke mercenaries from Transylvania, experienced fighters who knew the terrain of this part of the world. Combined with his own forces, the standing army and the full mobilization of the Great Army, he would have roughly 40,000 men. Against what was coming, that would have to be enough. What was coming was the Beylerbey of Rumelia, Hatem Suleiman Pasha, with orders to end the Moldavian problem permanently. Suleiman Pasha was a Bosnian-born Ottoman general, a eunuch, which is what Hadim means in Turkish, who had worked his way to the governorship of Rumelia, which was the largest and most important Ottoman province in Europe. He was not a man who had gotten where he was by being cautious or incompetent. But in September 1474, when he received Mehmed's orders, he was in the middle of besieging the Venetian-held city of Shkodër in what is now northern Albania, and his army was in bad shape. The siege of Shkodër had been running since May. The Venetian garrison under Antonio Loredano had held the fortress through everything Suleiman threw at it, and by August the Ottomans had settled into the grinding frustration of a siege that wasn't going to resolve quickly. The troops were worn down. The supply situation was difficult. And now Mehmed wanted Suleiman to abandon the siege, reassemble his forces in Sofia, march north through the Balkans in autumn, cross the Danube, on foot, over ice, continue north into Wallachia, pick up the Wallachian auxiliary forces, then push into Moldavia. In winter. To defeat a principality that had just spent 12 months burning its own food supplies. Suleiman is reported by multiple sources to have been deeply reluctant about this campaign. His troops were exhausted. Winter was closing in. The logistics were terrible. But he was the Beylerbey of Rumelia. Mehmed II had given him a direct order. Jan Długosz, the Polish chronicler who wrote one of the most detailed contemporary accounts of these events, even records that Suleiman was told what to do after Moldavia: advance toward Poland, winter there, then in spring push into Hungary and link up with Mehmed's main army. This was not a punitive expedition. This was the first move in a plan to extend the Ottoman frontier to the Carpathians. Suleiman gathered his army in Sofia in September 1474 and began the march north. His force was substantial and professionally composed. The backbone was the cavalry, provincial Sipahi horsemen who held land grants in exchange for military service, and irregular Akinci raiders who served as the fast-moving vanguard and scout screen. The heavy infantry included the Janissaries, Mehmed's elite standing force, tough and experienced. There were Timariot cavalry from the provincial levies, Tartar auxiliary horsemen who were particularly effective in pursuit and harassment, and irregular Azap foot soldiers who filled out the infantry numbers. The total cavalry strength alone was around 30,000. There were also 20,000 Bulgarian peasants attached to the army, not fighters but military labourers, tasked with shovelling snow off roads, building bridges over rivers, and driving the supply wagons. They were the logistical backbone of an army trying to move through winter terrain. By the time this force crossed into Wallachia and rested for 2 weeks, it picked up Basarab Lyota's 17,000 Wallachians, bringing the total to somewhere between 80,000 and 120,000 men, depending on which source you trust. Even at the lower figure, it dwarfed anything Moldavia could put in the field, and it was still coming. Stephen's response to the Ottoman advance was not to rush south and meet them. It was to make Moldavia as miserable as possible for an army that was already miserable. From the moment the Ottomans crossed into Moldavia in December 1474, they found a country that had been systematically stripped. The villages were empty. Not burned to the ground, Stephen didn't always destroy the structures, but emptied of everything that matters to a hungry army. Food stores gone, carried north or hidden underground. Livestock driven into the mountains. Wells contaminated, filled with debris, sometimes poisoned. The roads, such as they were unmarked and occasionally blocked by felled timber that had to be cleared by hand. The Bulgarian labour battalions earned their keep on this march, but it was slow, cold, exhausting work. At the same time, specialist Moldavian cavalry units, the light Kalarash horsemen, were running what we'd now call harassment operations. Not pitched battles, not anything that would risk serious losses. Small groups emerging from forest cover, striking at the flanks of the Ottoman column, killing stragglers, cutting off foraging parties, destroying supply wagons when they could catch them isolated, then disappearing back into the forest before Ottoman cavalry could respond in force. It was not glamorous work, but it was effective. An army that is constantly being nibbled at from directions it can't see develops a particular kind of exhaustion, not just physical, but psychological. You stop sleeping well. You stop trusting the perimeter. You start jumping at sounds. The Ottoman army entered Moldavia tired, and got more tired every day. Then Suleiman's scouts brought him a piece of information that seemed, on the surface, like good news. There were villages near Vaslui, southeast of the capital Suceava, that appeared to be intact. Supplies, possibly. Shelter. The kind of thing a hungry army moving through a stripped country would turn toward automatically. Stephen had left those villages alone, deliberately. The Ottoman army turned toward Vaslui, which is what Stephen had been waiting for, because Vaslui sat at the entrance to a particular valley, one that Stephen knew better than any other piece of ground in Moldavia, possibly better than any piece of ground in the world. The valley at Podul Înalt, the High Bridge. He had been there at 17, fighting beside his father Bogdan II, when Bogdan defeated a Polish invasion in 1450 at this exact location. He had stood in that valley and watched how the terrain worked. He had 25 years since then to think about what you could do to an enemy army in a place like that, if you set it up correctly. The geography of Podul Înalt is worth understanding in detail, because the terrain is not incidental to what happened there, it is the weapon. The valley itself is shaped like a rough semi-oval, enclosed on three sides by hills that rise steeply and are densely forested with oak and beech. The valley floor runs roughly north-south, narrowing as it goes. The Barlad River cuts through the floor of the valley, running roughly parallel to the main axis of advance, which means an army moving north through the valley has to cross it. The crossing point is a wooden bridge, Podul Înalt, the High Bridge, that connects the main road on the southern approach to the road continuing north toward Vaslui town and beyond that, Suceava. That bridge was not built for military traffic. It was a civilian structure, adequate for carts and foot traffic, not for thousands of men and horses moving quickly under pressure. The valley floor itself on both sides of the river is marshy, not swamp. It doesn't look dangerous from the outside, but the soil holds moisture from the river and doesn't drain well. And in January it sits in a state somewhere between soft ground and mud. Cavalry can cross it, but they can't gallop across it. Heavy formations can move through it, but slowly, and they lose cohesion. The hills on either side rise sharply enough that they're essentially impassable for organized formations. You're not flanking anyone through those forested slopes in a coordinated way. An army coming into this valley is committed to the valley floor, to the bridge, and to the narrow approach road. There is no tactical flexibility once you're in. And then there's the fog. The valley collects it. The river moisture, the shape of the hills, the winter temperature. On most winter mornings, and especially in mid-January, the valley fills with ground fog, dense enough to drop visibility to a few tens of feet. If you're an attacker coming into this valley and the fog is down, you cannot see where you're being shot from. You cannot see where your flanks are. You cannot coordinate with units you can't see. Your numerical advantage, the one thing you have over a smaller enemy, becomes meaningless because you can't bring it to bear. Numbers require coordination, and coordination requires visibility. Stephen had 20 cannons. He positioned them on the hillsides overlooking the bridge and the approaches, embedded in the tree line where they couldn't be seen from below. Each gun had been prepared with enough powder and shot for a minimum of 7 discharges. His artillery crews had specific instructions about conservation of ammunition, since resupply in the middle of a battle in winter is not a straightforward operation. The guns were pre-aimed. In the fog, the Moldavian gunners wouldn't need to acquire a visual target. They had the range, they had the angle, they had the bridge in their sights. They just had to wait for enough Ottomans to get on and around it. Archers were positioned in the forested hillsides on both flanks. Handgunners, soldiers armed with early firearms, which Stephen had incorporated into the Moldavian military, mixed in with the archers. These men had a specific instruction for operating in fog: aim at the sounds. The Moldavian military had done this before. Jan Długosz, in his chronicle, records that Moldavian horse archers had a practice of withdrawing into forests and firing at enemies who followed them, targeting by sound when visibility was poor. The soldiers on these hillsides were not improvising a novel technique. They had trained for exactly this. The valley centre, the floor between the hills, was where Stephen placed the Sekli mercenaries and the core of his professional infantry. Their role was specific and required discipline. Advance to meet the Ottoman vanguard, engage genuinely, hold the Ottoman infantry back, and then conduct a controlled retreat deeper into the valley, drawing the Ottoman main body forward. The key word is controlled. Retreat under pressure, with Ottoman Sipahi cavalry following, without it turning into a rout. That's hard to execute, and it required men who were trained well enough to not just run when things got difficult. Behind the ridgeline, invisible from below, Stephen positioned the bulk of his force. The heavy cavalry, boyars and their retinues, the Courtenay court cavalry, the Vitaiji lesser noble cavalry, were grouped for the main assault, and behind them, the Great Army. 30,000 peasants with axes and clubs and farm tools and hunting bows, untrained, unarmoured, and fighting for the particular reason that tends to make untrained men effective in desperate situations. They had absolutely nothing else to fall back on. Before the battle, Stephen sent something else into position. A unit of musicians, bugle players, infiltrated past the Ottoman column and placed themselves behind the Ottoman rear. Their orders were simple: wait for the signal, then play as loudly and chaotically as possible. It was a psychological tactic, almost theatrical. But Stephen had clearly thought carefully about what fog does to communication, and what unexpected sounds from an unexpected direction do to men who are already confused and frightened. The night before the battle, January 9th, the Ottoman camp was not a comfortable place. Suleiman's men had been marching and fighting their way through a hostile country in midwinter for weeks. Rations were poor and getting poorer. The horses were thin. The Bulgarian labourers had done their best to keep roads passable, but the logistics of feeding and supplying 80,000 men through stripped terrain in January had pushed the Ottoman supply system to its limit and past it. The army was cold, tired, and operating on the kind of low-grade misery that makes soldiers slow and commanders impatient. Suleiman had not conducted serious reconnaissance of the valley ahead. His light cavalry, the Akinci, had scouted the approaches, but apparently not in the depth that would have revealed the Moldavian positions in the forests on the hillsides. He knew there was a bridge, a narrow valley, and a Moldavian army somewhere to the north. He had enough men that the details probably seemed secondary. He had done this before, marched a large Ottoman army against a smaller enemy, and won on numbers and professional superiority. On the Moldavian side of the ridge, things were different. Stephen moved through the positions personally in the evening, checking the artillery emplacements, speaking to unit commanders. Priests moved among the peasant levies. The Orthodox clergy was deeply woven into Moldavian military culture, and the blessing of soldiers before battle was standard practice. Men who were about to go into combat for the first time, armed with farm tools, needed something to hold on to. The church provided it. The fog began settling into the valley as the temperature dropped through the night. By dawn, it would be the thickest fog of the week. Stephen had not summoned that fog, but he had chosen this valley partly because he knew what its winter mornings looked like. When the light came up grey and the fog sat 4 feet off the ground in the bowl below the forested hills, it was not a surprise to anyone on the Moldavian side. They had been briefed. They knew what to do in zero visibility. The Ottoman army waking up across the valley had not been briefed on anything like this. The asymmetry was not just numerical, it was informational. Stephen's men knew exactly where they were and what was coming. Suleiman's men were walking into a valley they'd never seen before, in fog, toward an enemy whose positions they hadn't mapped, in an army that was already exhausted before the fight began. Before dawn, January 10th, 1475. The Ottoman column begins to move. The Akinci light cavalry go first, as they always do. That's their job, riding ahead as the vanguard and scout screen, probing forward to find the enemy and report back. In normal conditions, this works well. In the fog that sits in the Podul Înalt valley on this particular morning, it works considerably less well. The Akinci can't see the hills on either side. They can see the road ahead for maybe 30 feet, then nothing. They move carefully, which is not their usual style. Akinci are raiders by nature, fast and aggressive. But even experienced cavalrymen slow down when they literally cannot see where they're going. The valley is quiet. The bridge is ahead. The main Ottoman body is several hundred yards back, moving in column, the front ranks pressing forward while the rear ranks are still untangling from the knight's camp. It's the kind of movement that looks organized from above, but feels chaotic from inside. Tens of thousands of men, horses, supply wagons, all pushing forward in a column that stretches back miles. The first contact comes from an unexpected direction. Not from ahead, not from the hills, from the side, briefly, in the fog. A small group of Moldavian Kalarashi horsemen appear out of the white, fire a volley of arrows, and wheel away before the Akinci can respond. By the time the Ottoman cavalry turns to pursue, the Moldavians are gone, back into the fog, back toward the hills. This is the opening move, the tease. The Akinci push forward. More Moldavian light cavalry appear. Same pattern. Emerge, fire, withdraw. The Ottoman vanguard presses ahead, because that's what you do when a smaller enemy retreats. You follow. This is standard doctrine, and the Moldavians are counting on it. Down in the valley centre, the first real engagement begins when the Ottoman infantry vanguard meets the Sekeli mercenaries. The Sekeli are experienced fighters from Transylvania, tough and well organized, and when 5,000 of them plant themselves across the valley floor and refuse to give ground, the Ottoman infantry has to actually fight for it. By contemporary accounts, the ZK successfully repelled approximately 7,000 Ottoman infantry in this initial contact, holding the line, taking casualties, giving none of the disorganized collapse that would have told the Ottomans something was wrong. For the Ottoman commanders watching from behind the fog, this looks like a genuine defensive engagement. Resistance that can be overcome with pressure. The natural response is to push more men forward. Suleiman orders the main body to advance. The Ottoman column presses into the valley, and now the geometry starts to matter. The valley floor narrows as you move north. The river is there, and the bridge is there. And thousands of men are pushing toward that bridge. Because it's the crossing point, and there's no other way forward. The cavalry, who need to get across to be effective, are pushing for the bridge from behind the infantry, creating pressure from the rear on men who can't move forward fast enough. The Bulgarian support troops with their wagons are somewhere further back, adding to the compression. The valley, which looks on a map like adequate space for a large army, becomes, when you fill it with 80,000 people all trying to move in the same direction through fog and mud, something that functions more like a funnel. The Moldavian artillery opened fire. 20 guns, positioned on the hillsides at 3 different elevations, firing down into the bridge area and the approaches. In the fog, there were no muzzle flashes visible from below. The guns were in the tree line, and the fog swallowed the smoke. What the Ottoman soldiers heard was thunder, coming from 3 different directions simultaneously, with no visible source. The first salvo hit the bridge approaches where the cavalry was concentrating, and the effect was not just physical, men killed, horses panicking, but psychological. Artillery fire from an invisible position coming from multiple angles, when you can't move, and you can't see, and you don't know where you are in relation to the enemy. That is a specific kind of fear that doesn't respond to courage or discipline. It responds to the most basic instinct, which is to get out of the way. And in this valley, in this fog, with pressure from behind, there was nowhere to get out of the way to. The archers on the hillsides opened up almost simultaneously with the guns. They could not see their targets. They were aiming at sounds, the thunder of hooves on the approach road, the creak and groan of the bridge under the weight of cavalry trying to force a crossing, the shouts of Ottoman commanders trying to direct movement they couldn't see, the particular clatter of plate armor in mass when thousands of men are trying to push through a constricted space. The Moldavian archers had been positioned at ranges that, given the geography of the valley, corresponded to the location of the bridge and the main road. They drew and released into the white, and their arrows fell into a mass of men and horses so densely packed that missing was difficult. The handgunners, armed with early firearms, crude by later standards but effective at close range, fired in the same direction, into the same sounds. From the Ottoman perspective, arrows and shot were falling from both sides of the valley, from positions that could not be located, in fog that made any kind of organized response impossible. You cannot charge an artillery position you cannot see up a forested hillside you can't climb in formation. You cannot suppress archers you cannot find. You can only take the fire and try to move. Then the bridge broke. Ottoman cavalry, pushing to get across, to get to the other bank where there might be space to maneuver, to get forward of the infantry massing behind them, had forced more weight onto the wooden structure than it was built for. It gave way. Horses and riders went into the Barlad River, January river water. The surviving horses panicked and added to the chaos on the near bank. The men and horses who went in, some made the far bank, most didn't in heavy armour. The crossing point was gone. Those Ottoman soldiers who had already made it across the bridge before it collapsed found themselves in a different problem. The far bank was marshy, the ground soft enough that heavy cavalry couldn't build up speed, and whatever coordinated advance they might have attempted was already disrupted by the loss of the crossing and the continued fire from the hillsides. They were on the wrong side of a broken bridge, in fog, in soft ground, being shot at. The Ottoman Sipahi cavalry, trying to find a way around the bridge problem, pushed toward the hillsides, looking for flanking routes, for ground that might give them room to operate. What they found was the forested slopes. And in those forested slopes, they found Moldavians, who had been waiting there for hours, who knew exactly where every tree was, and who had specifically prepared for cavalry in terrain where cavalry can't function. The flanking move failed. Meanwhile, in the valley centre, the Zeke soldiers completed their assigned retreat. They had held the Ottoman infantry for long enough, taking real casualties in the process, and now fell back as ordered, drawing the Ottoman main body further into the valley. But the controlled retreat hit a complication. The Ottoman Sipahi cavalry, pushing through the valley centre to exploit what looked like a Moldavian break, overran the retreating Zeke and scattered them. It was a genuine loss, a genuine reversal. The Zeke, who had executed their role well, paid for it when the cavalry caught them in the open. The Ottoman infantry, emboldened, pushed into the space the Zeke had vacated and hit the Moldavian flanks. For a period, and it's worth being honest about this because these histories sometimes smooth over the difficult moments, the battle was genuinely in doubt. The Ottoman infantry pressing the Moldavian flanks, the Sipahi having found some room in the valley centre, the bridge gone and the artillery still firing, but the Ottomans in close enough contact that some of their forward elements were reaching Moldavian positions. Suleiman, from his command position further back, saw the forward elements making progress and began organising a major push. He didn't know yet what had happened on the flanks and in the marshy ground. His view of the battle was incomplete, as anyone's view of any battle in thick fog will be. And what he could see suggested his superiority in numbers was beginning to tell. He ordered the main body forward. Hours had passed. It was midday, or close to it, by the time the battle reached its pivot. Stephen had been watching from the high ground on the ridgeline. He had not committed everything. The heavy cavalry, the boyar contingents, the curteni, the vitegi, were still behind the ridge, waiting. The 30,000 peasant levies were still behind the ridge, waiting. The moment that the Ottoman main body, responding to Suleiman's order to advance, began pushing forward into the valley, committing the bulk of the force into the funnel, Stephen gave the order. Everything came over the ridge at once. The heavy cavalry from 3 positions simultaneously pouring down from the hillsides into the flanks of the Ottoman column. The peasant infantry in their thousands coming over the ridge in the centre, in numbers that the Ottoman forces in the valley had no framework for, because they hadn't seen them, hadn't known they were there, had no count of Moldavian forces because the fog had hidden the Moldavian deployment from the beginning. The 1,800 Hungarian cavalry and the 2,000 Polish horsemen integrated into the attack on the flanks. The Ottoman army, already compressed, already confused, already being hammered by artillery and arrow fire for hours, had the entire Moldavian force descend on it from multiple directions simultaneously. And at that moment, the buglers behind the Ottoman column started playing. The men with the bugles were positioned somewhere in the Ottoman rear, behind the column. They had been there since before dawn, having infiltrated past the Ottoman camp in the dark. When they heard the signal, the sound of the Moldavian main assault crashing into the Ottoman flanks, they started blowing. Loud, sustained, chaotic noise coming from behind the Ottoman rear. Ottoman units at the back of the column, who hadn't been able to see anything all morning, who had been hearing artillery and screaming from ahead of them without being able to interpret what it meant, heard military trumpets behind them. From behind. In an army moving through fog in hostile territory, military horns from your rear means one thing: you're surrounded. Some units turned to face the sound. Some units tried to move toward it. The formation, which was already a mess, fractured completely. Suleiman tried to issue orders. His messengers couldn't get through. The Ottoman command structure, which worked through visual signals and mounted couriers, was not designed to function in fog, in compressed terrain, with enemy cavalry cutting through the column from the sides. He tried to rally the centre. The centre was already engaged with the Moldavian assault from the ridge. He tried to redirect the Sipahi. The Sipahi were dealing with Moldavian heavy cavalry on the flanks. He tried to signal a withdrawal to reorganize. By that point, there was nothing to withdraw. The fighting in the valley at midday was brutal in the way that close-quarters fighting always is, particularly when one side is committed and disorganized and the other side is fresh and knows exactly what they're doing. The Moldavian heavy cavalry in the confined space of the valley couldn't build up the charge speed that cavalry normally relies on. But that mattered less than expected, because the Ottoman forces were already so compressed that there was almost nowhere to fall back to. The peasant levies, the 30,000 men with axes and clubs and improvised weapons, hit the Ottoman formations in the centre. They were not soldiers. They were terrifying in the particular way that a crowd of angry men with blunt instruments can be terrifying when there is no room to avoid them. The Ottoman formations began to collapse. Not all at once, not uniformly, but section by section, starting at the edges and working inward. Units that could move turned and ran. Units that couldn't move tried to fight and found they couldn't coordinate. Suleiman, watching the collapse from his command position, finally did the only thing left to do. He signalled retreat. The Ottoman army broke. Not an organised withdrawal, not a fighting retreat with rear guards and formed units covering the pullback. A rout. Men dropping weapons, abandoning horses, leaving equipment where it lay. The Ottoman artillery, which had never gotten into effective action, which had been bottled up behind the bridge problem all morning, was left where it stood, intact, captured by Moldavian forces who didn't have to fight for it. Supply wagons were abandoned. The Bulgarian labourers, who were not soldiers and had never signed up for combat, scattered into the countryside. Standards were left where they fell. Suleiman Pasha got out. But he got out only because his personal Mamluk bodyguard, the elite household troops, whose job was the physical protection of the commander, fought a rearguard action that bought him the time to ride. His bodyguard did not survive that rearguard action. He did. He rode south through the fog and the chaos and eventually made it back across the Danube. The Wallachian contingent, Basarab Lyota's 17,000 men, who had marched north with the Ottoman column and whose presence had added meaningfully to Suleiman's total numbers, did something remarkable in its simplicity. They watched the battle. They saw how it was going, and they left. Not fighting for the Ottomans, not fighting for the Moldavians, just quietly removing themselves from a situation that was clearly going badly and heading south. The 17,000 Wallachians contributed to this battle exactly nothing. The pursuit began immediately. Moldavian light cavalry, the Kalarashi, who had spent the morning running luring missions, were now in their natural element, running down broken infantry across open country. The 2,000 Polish cavalry joined them. 3 days. They chased the Ottoman survivors south for 3 days, all the way to the town of Oblucița, modern Izakia, Romania, on the Danube, a distance of over 100 miles from the battlefield. The winter did the rest. Men who survived the cavalry, who found themselves in the open countryside in January with no food, no shelter, no horses, no weapons, and no formation around them. They died of exposure, or drowned trying to cross frozen tributaries of the Barlad on their own weight, or simply stopped and froze. For 3 days, the Moldavian hunters were very busy. The fog lifted sometime that afternoon, January 10th. The flat, grey January light came down into the valley at Podul Înalt and showed what was there. Collapsed bridge. Men and horses in the Barlad River, the current moving sluggishly around them. The abandoned Ottoman artillery pieces on the road, still loaded, cold now. Supply wagons with the axles broken or the horses gone. 36 Ottoman military standards, the battle flags that represented specific units, lying in the mud of the valley floor. And bodies, in numbers that are difficult to estimate and were probably not counted precisely by anyone, distributed across the valley, in the marshy ground, along the hillsides, on the bridge approaches, and for miles south along the line of the retreat. The casualty figures that come down to us from contemporary sources are staggering enough that historians have been arguing about them for 500 years. Jan Długosz, the Polish chronicler who was writing within a generation of the event and had access to accounts from the Polish cavalry who participated in the battle and the pursuit, puts the Ottoman dead at somewhere above 40,000. Venetian diplomatic dispatches — Venice had an extensive intelligence network in the region and a strong interest in monitoring Ottoman military capacity — report figures in the same range, with some going higher. The captured figure is cited consistently at around 4,000 men, including several senior Ottoman commanders. Whether the precise number is 40,000 or somewhat less, the scale of the defeat is not in serious dispute. Mara Brankovic, known also as Mara Hatun, was the former wife of Sultan Murad II, stepmother of Mehmed II, and a woman who had spent decades at the center of Ottoman court politics. When she told a Venetian envoy, from personal knowledge of the Ottoman military, that this had been the worst defeat the empire had ever suffered, she was not engaging in propaganda. She was giving an informed assessment from someone with a lifetime of context. That assessment matched what the contemporary sources from Poland, Venice, and Hungary all independently reported. The battlefield at Podul Înalt was not a neat thing. Battlefields never are. The valley floor that had been the killing ground was now a landscape of abandoned equipment, broken down animals, and the aftermath of the bridge collapse in the river. The Ottoman artillery pieces that had never gotten into action were recovered intact by the Moldavians, a meaningful gain for a small principality that couldn't easily manufacture or purchase heavy guns. The captured standards, 36 of them, were documented carefully because Stephen had an immediate use for them. Suleiman Pasha made it back to Ottoman territory. He had escaped through the sacrifice of his bodyguard, reached the Danube, and eventually reported to Constantinople. The consequences for his career were significant, but not fatal. Mehmed did not execute him, which was always a possibility after a disaster of this scale. But he was removed from the command that mattered. He was eventually reassigned as governor of the Sanjak of Amasya in Asia Minor, an administrative posting rather than a field command. The man who had been Beylerbey of Rumelia, the most important military governorship in the Ottoman European provinces, spent the rest of his career in secondary administrative roles. Mehmed understood that the failure at Vaslui was partly Suleiman's, and partly the nature of the campaign itself. Fighting in winter, in unfamiliar terrain, with a tired army. But the result was the result. In Constantinople, Mehmed II received the news and, according to contemporary accounts from multiple sources, refused to give audience to anyone for several days. This was a man who had conquered Constantinople at 21, who had expanded the empire in every direction, who was accustomed to winning. The silence after Vaslui was not the silence of a man planning his next move immediately. It was the silence of a man processing a shock. His other campaigns were paused. The planned operations in other directions were delayed while resources were reconsidered and plans were redrawn. The Venetians and Hungarians noticed. Uzun Hasan, the ruler of the Ak-Koyunlu Confederation in Persia, who had been trying to build an anti-Ottoman coalition with the European powers, used Vaslui directly in his arguments, telling European courts that Mehmed's best troops had been destroyed in Moldavia and that now was the moment to act. For a brief window, the strategic landscape shifted. Stephen, 15 days after the battle, on January 25, 1475, wrote to the kings of Europe. The letter to King Casimir IV of Poland was accompanied by 4 captured Ottoman commanders, 36 captured Ottoman standards, and a description of the battle. He asked clearly and urgently for money and men to continue the fight. He sent similar communications to Pope Sixtus IV and to Matthias Corvinus of Hungary. The logic was straightforward. He had just demonstrated that the Ottomans could be beaten in the field. He had prisoners and captured standards to prove it. He needed allies to turn a defensive victory into something larger. The responses were the kind that illustrate why Moldavia's situation was ultimately unsustainable. King Casimir of Poland pleaded poverty, both in money and in men, and did nothing. His own advisers, according to contemporary accounts, accused him of shameful inaction, and suggested he either act or give up his crown. He did neither. Pope Sixtus IV replied that he could not provide military assistance, but was pleased to grant Stephen the title of Athleta Christi, Champion of Christ, and described him in official correspondence as Verus Christianae Fidei Athleta, the true defender of the Christian faith. Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, most remarkably, wrote to the Pope and to other European courts, claiming that it was his forces, operating under the Voivode of Wallachia, that had defeated the Ottoman army. He was taking credit for a battle he had contributed 1,800 men to, while Stephen contributed everything else. The Ottoman prisoners taken at Vaslui, the common soldiers, not the commanders held for diplomatic purposes, were executed. This was standard practice for the region and the era. Stephen's treatment of prisoners was consistent with how warfare worked in 15th century Eastern Europe, which was not gentle. The captured commanders were kept alive because they were useful, as diplomatic currency and as evidence of the scale of the Moldavian victory. On January 20th, Basarab Laiota, the Wallachian prince who had brought 17,000 men to support the Ottoman invasion, and then watched the battle without participating, emerged from his castle and attacked some Ottoman stragglers who were still wandering through Wallachian territory. He captured one of their banners and sent it to a Hungarian contact as evidence of his bravery and loyalty to the Christian cause. Laiota's capacity for self-reinvention was, in its way, breathtaking. Mehmed II did not accept the result at Vaslui as the end of the matter. The following year, in the summer of 1476, he led a campaign into Moldavia himself. Not through a proxy, not through a provincial governor, the Sultan in person, with an army that contemporary sources put at 150,000 men, reinforced by 10,000 Wallachians under Basarab Laiota, and 30,000 Crimean Tatars under Menli I Jire. This was the full weight of the empire, brought to bear because a Moldavian prince with 40,000 men had embarrassed it. Stephen fought the summer campaign differently. He couldn't recreate the conditions of January, the fog, the frozen ground, the valley that worked as a funnel. In July 1476, at the Battle of Valia Alba, Mehmed caught him in circumstances more favourable to the Ottoman side, and Stephen was defeated. It was a genuine loss, the first major battlefield defeat Stephen suffered against the Ottomans. But Mehmed's summer campaign still failed in its ultimate objective. Stephen's fortresses held. The sieges of Suceava and Neamț were unsuccessful. Disease started moving through the Ottoman army, the kind of epidemic spread that hits large formations in summer heat in unfamiliar country. And then Vlad the Impaler, released from Hungarian captivity with Stephen's help, and given 200 Moldavian knights as a personal guard, invaded Wallachia from the west with Hungarian support, which forced Laiota to pull the Wallachian forces back and left the Ottomans' southern flank exposed. Mehmed withdrew. He had won the battle and not won the war. The broader pattern held for Stephen's lifetime. He ruled Moldavia until his death in 1504. 47 years as voivode, 47 years of fighting in every direction, losing almost nothing he fought for. He is said to have won 34 of 36 battles he commanded. The two he lost, Valia Alba in 1476 and one other, did not cost him his throne or his country. But the thing he had fought hardest for, the thing Vaslui had been about at its most fundamental level, slipped away anyway. In 1484, 9 years after the battle, the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid II sent an army north that captured Chilia and Akerman. The two Black Sea ports that Stephen had seized in 1465, that he had refused to give up when Mehmed demanded them, that had been the underlying cause of the entire war. They fell to a force he couldn't stop in a campaign he couldn't prevent. Moldavia became landlocked. The trade routes shifted. The economic leverage that had made Moldavia worth defending at such cost was gone. Stephen continued ruling and continued paying tribute to Constantinople, and continued being the most capable military ruler in the region. He built the Voronezh monastery between 1488 and 1490, in part to commemorate the victory at Vaslui. The exterior walls of Voronezh were painted decades later in a blue, vivid, intense, neither sky nor water, but something between them, that became so distinctive that art historians gave it a name. Voronezh blue, the same way they talk about Titian red. The monastery is still standing, still that colour, on the UNESCO World Heritage List. It is one of the finest examples of painted ecclesiastical architecture in Europe. Stephen the Great was canonized by the Romanian Orthodox Church in 1992, nearly 5 centuries after his death. He is, in the national memory of both Romania and Moldova, something between a military genius and a saint. Both designations have some basis in the historical record. What Vaslui actually demonstrated, beyond its immediate results, was something that the rest of Europe was slow to absorb. The Ottoman military was not invincible. It had specific vulnerabilities to winter conditions, to unfamiliar terrain, to an enemy willing to deny it the kind of open field engagement where its cavalry and numbers could be decisive. The army that had taken Constantinople was not the same army when it was cold, tired, hungry, operating in fog in a marshy valley in January. The empire that seemed to have no ceiling had a ceiling. It was harder to find than anyone had expected, but it was there. Stephen found it partly through intelligence, partly through preparation, partly through 25 years of thinking about that valley and what it could do to an enemy army, and partly, it's worth saying honestly, through luck. The fog on January 10th was thicker than usual. The bridge collapsed at exactly the right moment. Laiota's Wallachians chose neutrality instead of fighting for the Ottomans, which removed 17,000 men from the equation on the wrong side. Any one of those factors going differently changes the outcome. But luck favours the prepared. Stephen had prepared more thoroughly than any reasonable person would have thought necessary. He had turned a principality of 500,000 people into a military instrument capable of defeating an empire, and he had done it not by matching the empire's strengths, but by making the empire's strengths irrelevant. Centuries later, the valley at Podul Înalt is quiet farmland. The Barlad River still runs through it, shallow and unhurried, and the hills on either side are still forested. The wooden bridge is long gone. There's a modern crossing now, nothing remarkable. There's no grand monument at the exact site where the bridge stood. The local roads go about their business, and in January, when the weather comes in from the northeast, and the temperature drops, and the fog settles down from the hills into the low ground overnight, the valley fills with white in the morning, and the ground goes soft underfoot. It's the same ground. It does the same thing it did on January 10th, 1475. Stephen knew what it would do, and an army of 80,000 men walked into it anyway.